And it feels like it's been a blink of an eye since last year's Regenerative Poultry Convergence, and we reflected briefly on all the success and growth of the regenerative poultry ecosystem. And I just wanted to congratulate this community and everyone that participates in it. And we also know it's just the very beginning. And this panel includes a set of folks that I think are unquestionably contributing in very important ways to agroforestry and regenerative agriculture systems in the upper Midwest. And that I think we could all take a moment and appreciate that, and perhaps even give a round of applause for these individuals and everyone who's here advancing the system. So,
right back to all of you.
Great, yeah, thanks, Erik. So the theme of the panel today is a discussion among leaders developing hazelnuts as a viable agroforestry opportunity and solution in the upper Midwest. Topics will span plants, production, processing, people, and power, all considered through the lens of regenerative systems development. I will briefly introduce each of the panelists, and then we'll move through 3 to 5 questions. And we'll start with an intro to Reginaldo Haslett-Marroquin. Reginaldo began working on economic development projects with indigenous Guatemalan communities in 1988. He served as a consultant for the United Nations Development Program's Bureau for Latin America and as an advisor to the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, and was a founding member of the Fair Trade Federation in 1994. Since migrating to the US in 1992, Rehi has led the creation and launch of multiple enterprises. His first significant contribution to the US social enterprise sector was in 1995 when he founded Peace Coffee, which I can thank for getting me addicted to coffee for the rest of my life, which is a true story, by the way, and that was a Minnesota-based fair trade coffee company. Rehi's social enterprise development work includes woodland owner cooperatives and a multitude of inner-city new immigrant enterprise efforts in Minnesota. Haslett-Marroquin was named one of Minnesota MN Twin Cities International Citizens of the Year in 1996. In 2008, he received 2 Regional Service to Mankind Awards. He has served on numerous nonprofit boards. Rehi serves on multiple advisory boards to organizations working on regenerative agriculture with a focus on agroforestry as a global solution to climate, hunger, malnutrition, and poverty. Rehi is co-founder and CEO of Tree Range Farms, a Minnesota-based company, and leads multiple teams in Minnesota, South Dakota, Mexico, Guatemala, that have broken new ground in the regenerative food and agricultural field through an innovative poultry-centered regenerative agriculture system he has pioneered. A native Guatemalan, Rehi received his agronomy degree from the Escuela Nacional Central de Agricultura, studied at the Universidad de San Carlos in Guatemala, and graduated from Augsburg University in Minnesota. Rehi lives in Northfield, Minnesota with his wife, Amy. They own and operate a 64-acre farm where he continues to do R&D on regenerative poultry production systems. And next we have Erik Hagan. Erik sets the perennial vision for Savanna Institute's campus in Spring Green, Wisconsin. Since 2005, Erik has devoted himself to studying, teaching, and managing agroecological systems across the country. After receiving a Bachelor's of Science in Agriculture and Ecological Sciences from the Evergreen State College in 2009, Erik coordinated the South Puget Sound Small Farms program with WSU Extension and Mason Conservation District, providing education, research, and farm planning and technical assistance for producers in the region. Erik relocated to Pennsylvania in 2015 to work with the USDA Agricultural Research Service at the Pennsylvania State University while working towards a master's in ecology. During this time, Erik developed and managed a diversified agroforestry farm while co-coordinating outreach and training programs on agroforestry opportunities specific to the Northeast Mid-Atlantic region. Erik is excited to join the Midwest community in discovering, developing, and promoting resilient and regenerative models of agroecosystems for the Midwest and beyond. And lastly, excuse me, we have Jason Fischbach, who keeps it concise as ever. Jason Fischbach is the Emerging Crops Outreach Specialist for UW Extension and works on a wide range of new and emerging crops. His primary focus is on hazelnuts, with ongoing research and development projects on propagation, germplasm improvement, agronomics, post-harvest processing, and outreach education. He lives near Ashland, Wisconsin, where he and his wife operate a small vegetable and cut flower farm. So, with that, I'd like to welcome our panelists. Is this for Erik? Let me get to that question. And I would like to start with a question to Rehi. Rehi, can you speak to the type of mindset and strategy we need to bring to developing regenerative systems? This panel is about hazelnuts in the context of developing, through the lens of developing regenerative systems. And as a follow-up question, what roles do you envision hazelnuts specifically playing in a regenerative agriculture system in the upper Midwest?
Wow, so thank you again for all of you who are here. This morning, we literally laid out the mindset. That is a mindset that applies no matter where you are in the world. And actually, it doesn't matter which organism. I mean, all other organisms already think that way, behave that way, are that way. We're the ones who strayed away from our indigenousness to the planet. We are all, even the worms, are born both colonizers and indigenous to the elements of the planet. And like us, they will try to overpopulate. The difference is that for a lot of those organisms, the ecosystem balances them out. In our case, we happen to be a keystone species that has so much power. And so there is very little things that can balance us out. Now that's a mindset, right? What does that have to do with hazelnuts? Well, remember I told you this story of the birch trees, right? Now the birch trees did tell me not to top them. I have no idea. I don't know birch trees. I knew the maples were ready, and I could feel it. Now, later on, at the previous conversation, what's your name again? Sarah. So Sarah came over to me and said, the birch trees don't release the sap until the temperature goes above like 40, 50 degrees, which is not going to happen for another 2 weeks. And she said, go back and check with them again and see if they're okay being tapped. So that is a mindset. It's a way of being. It's a way of relating. It's a way of seeing our relationship with everything. And as a result of that mindset, the mind clears up and you can see the other 95% of opportunities that are hidden to us when we only think about extraction and about profits and about those immediate, what we call products. There is no such a thing in agriculture. There is no products. There is outputs, expressions of energy. When you think that way, and for me, this is how I came in contact with hazelnuts. I wasn't born in this ecosystem. I had no idea what hazelnuts were, never heard of them. But they taught to you. When we started doing chickens, all I knew was chickens are a jungle fowl. As a jungle fowl, what would be the jungle like here? I had no idea. I went to the elders in the Mille Lacs area and also in Pine Ridge. And actually, if Nick is here, we had a gathering in the Pine Ridge Reservation where there were over 40 organizations sitting there. And afterwards, we sat down with the elders and we had this little exercise. If you close your eyes and you imagine this landscape before we wrecked it, what would it look like and what would it tell you? So I came back. And sure enough, the hazelnut showed up immediately as a native species. It's got an incredible ability, physical and phenotypically and genotypically, a full expression of its ancestry in this space. It can withstand, just give it a second, it can withstand 90 miles an hour winds, flip over flat on the ground, and bounce right up after that is done. Not even ice can keep it down. It can penetrate the soil down to 12 feet in depth and spread up to 15 feet in diameter from its trunk. Once combined with the European Corylus cornuta, the Corylus americana becomes this highly productive species that we can now start to relate to in a different way. Now, that is a way of thinking that allows us to see. I would not be able to see that other 95% of possibilities if I came in trying to produce something. And that changes everything. That is what's called regenerative ways of being, of relating, of knowing. For it is after that that we can come up with the practices on the land that will regenerate. For regenerative, it's not something you define. It's not something you prescribed. Regenerative is something that happens. Whether you label it, name it, or not, or define it, it either does or it doesn't regenerate. And that's the only part that matters.
Thank you, Rehi. I'd like to move next to Jason. Anyone who was in the last session on hazelnut processing could clearly see, unquestionably, the contribution and effort that, Jason, you've made on hazelnut processing. You've also been very involved in partnership with researchers, growers, and community members over the last 15 years on hazelnut selection and breeding, and I'm wondering if you could provide an update on the status of hazelnut breeding and propagation work in the region, as well as the timeline and scale of plant availability.
Sure. How many of you are growing hazelnuts right now? Handful. How many of you want to? Should be every hand in the room.
Hand wasn't up for that.
Yeah. Is Sabina here still? Yes.
Front row.
Okay. So hazelnuts, of course, been in our region since the glaciers receded, and they grow everywhere until they were all cut down for the most part. But so the American hazelnut you can find and grow, and it achieves all the things that you want in terms from an agroforestry standpoint, except the nut production just is too low for the most part. Okay. So some pioneering growers and early adopters said, well, let's start making crosses with American hazelnut with European hazelnut. Let's go out and look for the best American hazelnut plants that are out there. And let's then start saving seed from those best plants, grow them out, and growers can grow them. And that's still available. And one role that we played at the university when we first started back in 2007 was to better understand what those genetics could do. What were their strengths? What were their limitations? Strengths, resistance to eastern filbert blight. They can grow in a wide range of environments in the upper Midwest. Like Rehi said, they're tenacious plants once they're established. And so they, again, achieve all these objectives that we want out of a hazelnut. We also learned that the average yield on a per acre basis is about 300 pounds of kernel per acre. If you can build a system that makes money off of that, then we have the genetics that work. If you can extract, that's the worst possible word I could have used. If you can, if you can find other profit centers, revenue sources from that same acre of land, from poultry, from asparagus, from whatever, then maybe the 300 pounds of kernel per acre works. Because again, you get all the same benefits out of that hazelnut plant as you would the very best yielding plant you could imagine, right? Okay, but the grower community had 20 years to try to make those work, those genetics. Now this is before Rehi showed up with the poultry system, so maybe that explains why it didn't work. But if those genetics were going to work, the growers would have figured it out and made it work. But 300 pounds per acre with highly variable maturity dates, plant size, nut shape, nut yields, right? It's just gonna make it work. Okay, so since then, what we've been trying to do is go through all of those populations, which is a huge resource. I mean, the time and energy that these early adopters, not only to produce the plant material, but then to grow it, they maybe thought they were gonna get a lot more nuts than they did, but they have some amazing plant material that is really gonna serve as the basis of the industry going forward. So what we've been trying to do is find the best of the plants to try to bring, you put a production field in and you get higher yields than 300 pounds per acre. Can we get close to, say, Oregon yields? We can. We can easily push 1,000 to 1,500 pounds of kernel per acre. Guess what? You can also still put poultry underneath those plants. You can still do asparagus. You can do still everything else, but you've got more kernel to work with in your system. So we've had the top, I don't know, 10 or 15, and we collectively refer to those as the first-gen selections, the UM-HDI first-gen selections. The bottleneck has been propagation. If I wished I worked some days in any other species but hazelnuts, because hazelnuts are so hard to propagate. You can't just stick a cutting in the ground and it grows roots and you got another plant. That's been our challenge. And we maybe made some bad decisions early on about how aggressive to be in working with many different techniques and platforms and people or nurseries to propagate it. We kind of put all our eggs in a couple limited baskets and we waited and we waited and we waited and didn't get results. So in the last few years, we've really broadened out to the point where if we can think of any possible way to propagate this material for you, that's what we're going to do. So in terms of availability, we're hoping as early as this year, the end of this year. We're not ready to quite say we can take orders yet, but 2023 and for sure 2024 based on our current trajectories. Again, the seedlings are still available, and they're not necessarily available in big quantities because the demand from growers hasn't been available in big, or hasn't been, aggregated and brought to nurseries to say we want 1 million plants or whatever it might be. The nurseries, I think, are ready to scale both bare root production but also containerized material. Okay, so we knew going into this that this is a risk to narrow down this gene pool to, say, a dozen top genetics clonally propagated. So we definitely still see production systems including seedlings, including for our border rows and our pollinizer rows. And so having that mix of both seedlings and clonally propagated material, I think, is our future. As I talked about in my previous presentation, I think it's super important that we think strategically about where this limited plant material goes. Most other industries that are sort of left to their own devices in free market, you get lots of very little growers that are, hobby or very small commercial, scattered all over the place. Makes it almost impossible to work together. It makes it really hard to aggregate volumes and makes it hard to do anything at scale. So what we're trying to do is come up with mechanisms that encourages you as growers to form clusters. So if you're interested in growing hazelnuts, the next best thing you can do is get your neighbors to be interested in growing hazelnuts. And now you've got a cluster, and now you can work together with processing equipment, post-harvest processing equipment, planting equipment, and there's just a culture of hazelnut production in your neighborhood, and that's where you get to be successful. Oftentimes we see in industries it's very competitive, it's very closed off. I'm growing hazelnuts and I'm not talking to anybody else about growing hazelnuts because I'm going to be the one to make the $1 million. It can't do that. If that's the way the industry forms, it's going to fail. And we have many models like that where we get in the way of ourselves. So we're trying to definitely collaborate and structurally build in mechanisms to almost force collaboration and clustering. So it's why it's so great what Rehi and RAA is doing in tree crops is building that clustering and that cooperation into their production model, because it's essential.
Thanks. Thanks,
30
Jason.
seconds, that's what I...
That's great, yeah. That was ultra concise. And I think there's a widespread understanding of the early challenges in hazelnut propagation, but I don't think we can blame you because I'm sure none of us have made bad decisions early on with our farm goals and in our life. But it's some progress is being made, which is a great timing for this industry, for the propagation successes to be coming out of the woodwork, so to speak, while this level of organizing and production systems are being developed.
We need to recognize too just how small we are. Like I said in my presentation, I don't see us having more than 10,000 pounds of in-shell nuts until more until 2026. Oregon last year produced 155 million pounds. I mean, we don't have an industry.
Right.
And so if we're going to have one, we need to get plant material in the ground. We need to get it in the ground soon. And that means growers have to take risks. Others have to help de-risk the planting by growers. Anything we can do to get these plants in the ground. Otherwise, we got nothing.
Thanks, Jason. We are going to transition to production. And so here, next to me, Erik Hagan with the Savanna Institute. I had the opportunity, as maybe some of you had, and if you haven't, you should. Next time you can, visit the home farm in Spring Green, Wisconsin. If I had to describe it, it would be #farmgoals. It was a tremendous experience to walk into what, as I understand, was a cornfield the year prior, and it was rolling hills, maybe 15 acres of alley-cropped chestnuts and hazelnuts with, I believe, sweet potatoes and carrots and other specialty crops and some grasses, and it was really tremendous to see the work that they're doing. And so, Erik, I'm wondering if you could briefly share some visuals of your work and your experience developing hazelnut alley cropping and silvopasture systems, and then I have a follow-up question for you as well.
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, so what I want to kind of get everybody on the same page is like, what is alley cropping to start with? So alley cropping is the production of grains or hay or forage or some kind of annual cropping system within rows of trees. Now this is pretty linear thinking, right? Or maybe not so much thinking, but it's physically linear. But we think about alley cropping as an early succession as part of a long-term evolutionary process. So you start with growing the annual systems within the trees that you're waiting for it to come into production, and then it slowly develops into something else. It's building an opportunity for a process to carry forward into a million opportunities, but in this case of this imagery example here, into a silvopasture system. So what we do, so again with alley cropping, it's the integration on a kind of repeated pattern based on a standard width of what you're trying to grow for a crop in between those rows of trees. So as an example, in this case, this is an organic farmer growing between rows of chestnuts. He does organic grains of either dry beans or sunflowers for oils, or a whole mix of different things. It could be wheat, it could be rye, it could be barley, it could be chicken feed. And it's at a set standard to this person's operating equipment. So again, it's kind of a linear engineered system. You have to be pretty precise and exact with that repetition pattern. And so what we did was a similar kind of concept. So we are in year 1 of our Spring Green campus farm in Spring Green, Wisconsin. As Colin mentioned, this is a 300-acre farm where we're looking at doing broilers and sheep and cattle and growing feed, growing food grains, growing beans, growing food, growing hazelnuts on a very large scale. This is a system that we're exploring to kind of carry forward what Jason was just describing. How do we scale this system up, and how do we do it economically from start to finish, essentially? But there is no ever finish. Again, it's a process that continues on and on and on. But how do we start it in a way that gets growers into it? And how do we get that kind of early adoption, especially that risk adoption barrier, reduced for farmers? So we started in a cornfield. Prior to this planting that you see here, it was a straight cornfield, a silage corn, kind of the worst kind, just full harvest of all the above ground biomass, organic matter of about 1%. We did a full year of cover cropping to try to start reinvigorating the soil process, and then we started cropping specialty crops in between it. So in this image here, it's carrots. 4 beds of carrots, basically treating the hazelnuts as if this is a vegetable farm and you have beds of crops, and the hazelnuts are just every 5th bed. It's that simple. It's just a repeated pattern. This happened to works very well for us because carrots is a very high value crop. It's a commodity crop. We're selling to food banks and wholesale buyers and different food service providers for those in need. So it's a real big need in our community to grow lots of bulk produce. So it was really easy for us to adopt and really find an easy market to get into. Same with potatoes.
Erik, can you go back one slide?
Sure thing. Mm-hmm.
So look how nice those hazelnuts look in their first year. So we're used to retirees walking around in a quackgrass field with their 100 plants, and they're reading Wendell Berry and not weeding their hazelnuts, and they look terrible, and they don't grow, and then we freak out. But then when we see a real grower like Erik that is actually trying to grow hazelnuts, they respond, they grow really well, and they're getting nuts in their 2nd year. Usually we tell people, well, you're gonna have to wait till your 4th year.
Right.
Oh, right, if you take care of them, you actually get some good production, good growth. So it's important just that we change that mindset from just kind of a hobby fun crop to actually trying to do this to grow food and make a living.
Yeah, and it's all about focusing on the ecosystem, just like Regi's saying. This is focusing on each plant as an individual. We are asking of it to produce for us. We're asking of it to participate in our habitat. So we provide for it just as much as even more than it should provide for us. And that's what we do. That's why alley cropping is also a great opportunity, because not only are you just focusing on that crop, but you're focusing on what happens in the interaction between the crop. You do that over a whole field. Now you have a tremendous amount of interactions, a tremendous amount of opportunities. We can take this on a commodity scale and just grow wheat, barley, and hay in between this and have 3 crops on there, or even just 1 crop. But with alley cropping, it sets you up in really nice pattern dynamic where you can grow veggies in it 1 year with cover crop, and then in the fall you raise your broilers on it. And then after the broilers, that's when you do your wheat crop for the following, as a winter wheat crop. You harvest that wheat and you put animals on it. And it's just, again, this kind of never-ending cycle of opportunities, all while the hazelnuts are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, retaining that nutrient, cycling the nutrients, providing habitat, providing opportunities for us, and everything else around it to consume from it as well. And I can go on and on and on. I don't want to be like him.
Well, Erik, in your first few years at this home farm, at least my experience when I visited was there was a tremendous diversity of almost like large-scale experiments going on, which I think is what you're saying it maybe always should be, but also are you starting to learn some of those rotations that might work best, at least at this location, and would you be willing to share that with everyone?
Yeah, I think so. This is very early, so we get these plants that are about this tall. You got a full year basically do whatever you want in between them. It's like absolutely no limitation. The biggest limitation is making sure you can get into the rows of hazelnuts and take care of them. Just like Jason said, you don't just plant it and forget it. So there's a lot of ways you can do that. This image here actually is an interesting one where this is an alfalfa field. We take a cutting of alfalfa on it. This is second cutting. And we actually chopped it and blew it right in place for weed and nutrient cycling. So now we just added our nitrogen fertilization for the season, as well as smothering weed suppression. So we're not applying herbicide. We're all certifying all this organic this year through this process. So that's one way to do it, right? You could do this in a haying context. We can literally start grazing this year with chickens or with sheep or with cattle. But there's a lot of considerations in that. Like I said earlier, alley cropping is a repeated pattern based on your biggest limitation, usually like a harvester of some kind, a corn harvester, a combine, or whatever. If you're going to do silvopasture, if you're thinking about silvopasture or raising birds, if you're going to do a mobile bird system, you need to think about how your mobile system runs through the alleyways here. Or if you're building a chicken barn, how the bird's actually accessing that? How you're going to divide them within that, and then how you're going to get other equipment in there to manage that as well. I definitely think the specialty market is huge. I think growing grains for this is huge. One of the things that I would really like to see is as we start figuring out the plant availability, get really good at growing them and figuring out exactly how to grow them really well. Now we can start going after, if we're contracting growers to grow the grain for poultry production, now we can go after those producers to start growing hazelnuts, potentially as a feed or as a food or both. I think over time we're going to start finding genetics that are going to be really good for different things. We'll find some that are really good, extreme harvesters, but a total nightmare to actually put in a bag and sell to somebody. Maybe that's a feed line. Or as a byproduct, we might find a feed line out of that. So thinking about how these scale up in tandem with annual cropping and reduce the annual cropping, reduce that disturbance that we rely on annual cropping, and increase the perennial systems. And hazelnuts, I think, is an absolutely perfect way to do that, to start.
Well, first thing is to do a time check with the team. We started a little after 3. We're not intending to end directly at 3. Does anyone have any input on that? Okay. Well, I think we're probably going to go a little over 3 if that's okay, but we won't hold too long. I wanted to next move from this individual farm level to then the immediate question that Jason, you started to speak to in the last session, and Ray, you've given a lot of thought to, is scaling to the regional level. You automatically run into very important questions about governance and organizing and working together and leadership development. So again, going back to this theme of developing regenerative systems, I'm wondering if you could speak to, or if anyone up here could speak to, how you think we need to approach the topics of grower leadership, development, organizing, and governance of hazelnuts, but also the regenerative poultry ecosystem.
Right, so first of all, I thought Jason was going to say, if you want to grow hazelnuts, start growing some chickens. And also, since Martin Larson is here, and he's a really important partner in the region here out of Byron, and you were talking about grains, and you had wheat on the third one. Remember that if you put oats, you get field gluten-free certified oats, rather than if you put wheat, you can't get them for 2 years. So just a little thought there for economics and for that kind of thinking about streamlining crops. So it comes back to what I just said. There is most of what we do in small farms is not scalable. And most of what we do in small farms is not economically viable. But it's only true because we tend to operate in the, in this excitement of individually trying to make it in this space. Unfortunately for us, and fortunately, that forced cooperation you're talking about, it doesn't have to be. As long as you can relax your mind, your body, and your spirit, surrender to collective impact. As long as you can do that, you start seeing the other 95% of possibilities, then you will find working alone. When you start doing that, then we can take exactly what we have right now. It's called assets-based development. And that's what we did with the chicken. We heard the stories. 30 plus years of research and development. The hazelnuts are not ready. They are too small, too much diversity. They are not predictable. All of these things, right? And we said, it's true. There was no disagreement there. But what we said was, is there a way to standardize a process where we take exactly what we have, the assets again, and based on that, let's just start deploying them. If they don't work, then we replace them as we figure out what's working. And if we can reduce the risk to the farmers, and that's where the chicken came in. I mean, literally, the chicken didn't cross the road. In fact, the real thing is, did the chicken cross your mind? So what happens, what we did right after was to standardize processes, methodology, the science, the management, the finances, the training, codify, all of that body of work that had to be done, and then also develop the physical and the institutional infrastructure, the processing facility, the grain cleaning equipment that Martin put together this last year, all of those things. Tony working on the processing facility down in Stacyville. Will Crombie coming in and putting the first 2 coops so that we could fine-tune the poultry part. All of that, and then standardize it so that it would meet what we wanted ecologically. It will meet what we wanted socially, which was the engagement of a lot of people, not just a few large farms. And this is why cattle just wouldn't work for us, because we were onto the people business. And then finally, doing the least potential disruption of the ecology. But once you can standardize those processes and still get to these outcomes we want, now we can structure economic infrastructure, we can structure ecological processes, like my farm, for example. You went there. There is no questioning, no wondering, no guessing. This is what you do, bam, 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 and at the end, 10 years from now, you have the poultry that I have at the other place. That's no longer up for grabs. That you can modify the way you do that, but you end up with the same result. And once we do that, then we come into this space. We are here because of the chickens, right? And so we are here because hazelnuts are critical to chickens, because we need grain for the chickens, because farmers need to make a living out of the chickens, because all of it is about the chicken, and we are here because of that. Having standardized that allows us now to organize what we are going to be calling the Regenerative Poultry Council. And that becomes the social governing body that makes the decision for anything poultry related. And so if we come in with the hazelnut, do the same process, do the same methodologically and systematic organization of all of the critical factors, including the breeds, the species we have, doesn't have to be perfect. They are there, and we should include them. Once we do that, then we can organize not only the deployment, the processes, the de-risking, the financing, but also very rapid scalability and deployment, which is impossible to do unless we think that way. And so that's where we are coming now. It's like, okay, we need, so to start with, we degenerated in the context of agriculture because we abandoned our collective ownership, our collective control, and our collective governance of the system. The conventional system is what it is because it took those 3 things away from us, from the communities. If we have those 3 things, we get to decide what happens on the land. It really is that simple. And so we have to standardize, do those things, and reclaim that ownership, control, and governance. And right now, we are at the governance level already. And we got to bring every sector through that path until we get hazelnut growers independently governing, controlling, and owning that part. And then same with chicken, same with beef, same with pigs, same with anything we do in this agriculture. For it to be regenerative at the end, we have to remove the colonizing, extractive mentality, because that way is how we degenerated and ended up where we are today.
Thank you, Ray. I have one last question for the panel, and it's a surprise question. The panelists don't know about it. we did a little planning beforehand, but thinking here today that we have three, unique individuals involved in the space, but you're also spend your day-to-day work in a group or organization or institution that are all interacting in interesting and productive ways, but we also have lots of questions to figure out. So we have Tree Range Farms and the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance, University of Wisconsin, working closely with other institutions, and the Savanna Institute. And so I'm wondering for our panelists, whether it's with Hazelnut specifically or your work more broadly, what question, are there any questions you have for each other that you'd like to discuss about Hazelnut Production System, silvopasture? I think it might be interesting to hear you discuss with one another where your work is at and whether you have questions for each other.
Sure.
It was a surprise.
Yeah, that's definitely surprising. Well, I never question my peers. Just
Never.
I agree with you guys.
Yeah, I can't think of anything offhand. I mean, partly for me, I'm new to this community as well, so I'm just here to learn, connect, and collaborate, and figure out how we can collaborate. So that's kind of think where I'm interested in is, in what ways can I guess our organization participate and help build and extend the network out if that's like what is needed. What is a way for an organization like us who is focused on the system to engage and participate? And is there opportunity for that?
Since we're out of time, why don't we open it up to the...
We could do that as well.
You question us instead of us.
Thought it might be an interesting component of interaction, but we'd be glad to take several questions from the audience for individual panelists or the panel as a whole. If you want to just throw your hand up, we got one in the back. Yep, go ahead. I'm not yeah, we might have to project. I'll repeat the question.
What's the most surprising thing that any of you have learned as part of this, or that you think would surprise others in getting into this business?
I'll repeat for the sake of the recording. What is the most surprising thing or any surprising thing as you got into this that you might like to communicate to others?
For me, it's a very simple answer because I am absolutely not only surprised, but blown away by the fact that I have never tried to convince anybody to do what we're doing. And here we are. And this is only a sample of the amount of people that are now behind this system. That literally is not only rewarding, but very surprising, because I always thought that everybody in the US was a colonizer back when I was in Guatemala. And it isn't true. There's a lot of beautiful people here.
Other questions?
Can I try to answer?
Yeah, sure.
I've been trying to figure out how to get myself in trouble since we started the panel. So
You succeeded at once or twice.
yeah, so because how to bring up this topic, because I think it's important, but it's also a little tricky. And here's my segue into. So one thing I've been surprised by is my work with hazelnuts is how. Here we go. How old everybody is that I work with. Name your specialty horticulture crop, especially new ones, and we tend to see retirees pick up this as something they want to do. So they enter the field with very little agricultural experience. They're in their 60s, and they plant hazelnuts. And the reality is, it's probably a 10-year project. Now they're in their 70s, and health concerns show up, and energy level declines. And if you look at the growers that we started working with, a number of them have since aged out and their plantings are gone. If you look at our conference, it's pretty old average age. Not to say that this can't be done later years, for sure, especially if there's a succession plan in place. But the reality is we have struggled to get younger folks to put hazelnuts in the ground. And I think part of it is the cost that's involved. Part of it is and by younger, I'm talking 30s and 40s, not even 20s. And part of it is it real yet? Is there a true opportunity for growers to do? And maybe once it's demonstrated, like the Savanna Institute, then the folks that are in their prime working years and trying to figure out how to pay the bills will take on hazelnuts as a crop. But that's definitely something that surprised me when I started working. I thought everybody would be super excited, and people that were showing up were retirees. So how did I do it? I get myself
Yeah, you're like third time's a charm. Next one. Yeah. Do you want to respond to that, or should we go to another question?
Yeah, if I can just add to that really quick. I think my answer to that question, and a little bit of follow-up on what Jason just said, is complexity is not that hard. It takes a little bit of forward thinking and planning, but this is no different than any other farming system there is. It's just figure it out and do it. And the fun of this kind of farming is that there are so many possible interactions. Now there's joy back into it. There's observation, there's participation. And a lot of people, I got my start in permaculture. And that really is difficult. It's really hard to understand all the interactions. It's really hard to think about things at that complexity. But when we start scaling systems up, it doesn't mean it gets harder. It actually gets easier. And the complexity just makes it actually more streamlined. You're relying on other things to work for itself, to actually create a system. So again, I think it takes a little bit more forward thinking and a little bit help from the community to think through it all. But so I just want to ensure that, or I guess express that, like, we're talking a new emergent crop and new pioneering frontier, these horrible things, right? This isn't anything new. There's a lot of support. There's a big community around it. We're all here to help, and it's really not that hard. It's actually a lot more fun and engaging than one can think.
Wonderful
So
thoughts.
that was surprising to me, I should say, because I was terrified when I started. They grow really on their own. I don't do anything, but he gives me a lot of credit. I really don't understand.
I think we can take maybe one or two more questions from the audience, and we won't go too much past 3. Go ahead, Al. Uh-oh, it's Al Krause. Go ahead.
So, one of the things about the corn and bean world is there's not a lot of, there's a certain amount of effort put into marketing, but really it's around price risk management. You don't have to find the market, if you will. But in comparison, what we're really talking about is a lot of diversity in profit centers, right? A lot of different areas to market into with these systems of we've been talking about here. How much of that have you dedicated time to, and how challenging do you see that playing out in front of the audience here today and in front of the folks that you want to engage into the marketing of these products?
So again, just for the recording, I'll mention that Al's question was that these systems involve a lot of different profit centers, developing, and the challenge of developing markets outside of the broadline commodities that exist in the current upper Midwestern agricultural system, and how much effort have you put into that side of market development with respect to your work?
Poultry or hazelnuts are we talking?
Your choice, as long as you get yourself in trouble.
Yeah.
Can I rephrase the question?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So what I'm really thinking about is, if I want to get into this, how much of my time do I need to really think about all of these different crops that I'm going to be growing to be a profitable production center, pardon the word, Regie, of production. Don't use that along with extraction, by the way. There's a certain amount of effort that individuals are going to have to put into marketing chickens, marketing hazelnuts, other crops, carrots, and small grains, and so on and so forth.
I can address some of that.
Yeah.
What you're expressing is exactly what an individual processes things like. And that's what we don't do. The decolonization of the mind is so critical in this space, because when we think as individuals, everything is 100 times more difficult and probably 3 to 10 times more expensive. That's where we are working as a collective, as a system. So as a farmer, I don't want to be worried about my chickens. Or if I produce grain, I don't want to be thinking about how do I market my grain. My grain. That's what I'm getting right now. But what happens is, in our case, literally we went around layering the system into the multiple pieces until we got to the farmer level, where all of those concerns are real and tangible, but only because the farmer is thinking as individual. As we deploy tree-range farms right now, tree-range farms takes all of that responsibility, and then we can manage that on behalf of the collective so that the farmer can go home at 6 p.m. or whenever the heck they want to go home. that there is a support. So if I can't take care of my chickens for the next week, my farmer neighbor is also trained on the same system, knows exactly what needs to be done, and can come and help over. All of those things are only doable through collective effort. The challenge of the corn and soybean farmers, and this is where it went wrong, is that they gave up control, ownership, and governance, and as a result, they are really literally indentured servants of a system that doesn't really care about them. But now they can't get out of that loop. And so that's because they thought of it only as individuals, and we cannot do that if we're going to succeed at this kind of work.
So in the hazelnuts, it was definitely front and center when we started this, is that there has to be a market because there kind of isn't one right now. I mean, there is. So for example, General Mills, Mars, bigger companies, they'd love to buy Midwest hazelnuts. Let us know when the trucks are going to be at the gate, right? It's like, well, we have 10,000 pounds. So those markets aren't available, and even if they were, I'm not sure we'd want to go to them necessarily because you're not going to get your top dollar selling them there. That said, so along with developing germplasm, we've been standing up the American Hazelnut Company, which is a grower-owned processing and marketing company, so that growers that didn't want to do all that on their own could just join the company and still own a part of that value chain, and then also help build their own market at the same time by working together. There will be other growers that are more than happy to do their own marketing. Great, go for it. But we're just trying to provide a mechanism that allows many different ways to get to market, and that grower-owned part was an essential component.
I did get the signal from the boss that we might need to wrap up. So, let's say that again.
Dave had a question.
Let's do one last question, and then we'll move to close.
The privilege of the out of town.
Yeah.
So we've heard in this session and others that there's many different kinds of risks of moving from, we'll just call it conventional agriculture to the systems we're talking about. Can any of the panelists or one of the panelists talk about which ones of those risks might be perceived risks that might be easier to overcome, or actual risks that I think that this community together really needs to work to overcome some of these actual risks that are in front of us?
So the question was about perceived risks in adopting and scaling these systems relative to what may be actually more significant risks we all need to face together. Do our panelists have any idea about how to differentiate those and strategies to address those actual risks? Way to end on a simple question, David. Yeah.
So quickly, for me, the risk is that as a society, we don't wake up, we don't change the culture that is dominating today, and all of these great ways of going forward and fixing the planetary issues just don't get a chance. That's the biggest risk in front of me right now, is the culture. Markets, all of those things, we can figure them out. But the culture of always pushing down anything that is not already like proven, scientifically verified, economically profitable, all of those things, that culture to me, which is the colonizing culture, that is the biggest risk we have right now.
Any other responses?
Well, we think about that all the time with these plants that the genotypes we're trying to produce. Are they good enough? So maybe I guess it's sort of a question to Erik is, the university went through this evaluation. We did everything we could without, the ultimate is somebody grows 10 acres of it on multiple sites and then 10 years later tell us how it was. But if we wait for that, now we're waiting another decade. So we need folks like Erik to take the risk and grow it out. So I guess the question is, did we sell you a bill of goods on this plant material, and what did you do to try to mitigate the risk that we've put in your lap right now as being a go first farm, right?
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent question to ask too, because it really kind of puts the power back in the people in terms of like how do we engage together? And I think we are so close to making a lot of this work. And one of my concerns, because I'm kind of betting my career on this a little bit, if I were to think a little linearly,
A little bit.
is that we get so close with a lot of these crops, and then the community fizzles out. There's conflict, there's complications, there's challenges, there's the age, no succession planning, whatever it is. But we've gotten better at knowing how to do that. We've gotten better at knowing how to work together and creating community, creating good process, creating good strategy and organization. Let's just not stop. We take this on as a go first farm, but we are just the next iteration of it. We are asking others to participate. We're actively trying to continue to work with Jason and other groups to help advance that and asking others to take it one step further too. So I think it's going to take all of us to take risk and making sure that the pieces don't fall. And that's what I said earlier. It's like, yeah, this is complex, but all it takes is just do it. Just get out there and do it. There is support out there. There are cost share programs out there. There are networks of people out there that will give you plant supplies if you don't have the capital to start, or give you the technical expertise to help you start. There are systems already in place. It just takes people to actually ask for it and continue to engage and just do it. Just start, small steps.
I think we could have a long and continued conversation, and we likely will later today and tomorrow. I'd like to move this panel toward close. And I think as closing thoughts, as a reflection, I started with a reflection. I'll just end with a very brief reflection to highlight a few words that Erik said about the production system there at the home farm. And the phrase that I'm left with at the end of this, as we were talking about developing these different aspects of the Hazelnut enterprise through the lens of regenerative systems development, is I heard him say, endless cycles of relationships and opportunity. And that's it.
Simple complexity.
Someone write that down.